Hello and welcome to Azure Serverless Conference. It's a pleasure for me to be here today sharing this presentation with all of you. Introduction to Azure SQL, in where we will be covering all the different components of the Azure SQL family. Let's start. My name is Javier Villegas. I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I work as IT director at Mediterranean Shipping Company. I've been involved with SQL Server for more than 20 years. I'm also Microsoft MVP in the data platform category since 2016. I'm Microsoft certified trainer and also member of the Azure Data Tech Community Board of Advisors. Additionally, I'm also technical speaker. I've been part of multiple conferences where I was able to present. Additionally, I am member of the SQL Argentina local community in where we have our monthly meetings with our local team. At the left side of the screen, you will see all my contact information, my email address, LinkedIn, Twitter, and my blog in case you want to reach me. Let's start. This is the marketing slide that Microsoft used to present the different components of Azure SQL. There are mainly three components, but now there is a fourth one, which is brand new. So let's focus on the first three components, and then we will mention this fourth component. All right, let's start. The first division that we can have within the Azure SQL umbrella is how we're gonna group the product and services. At one side of the screen, we have infrastructure as a service, in where we have as infrastructure as a service the possibility of deploying a virtual machine running SQL Server, right? This is the same SQL Server that we've been using over the years in our on-premise environment, in our virtual machines, in our local computers, right? Exactly the same SQL Server, but running at the top of a virtual machine in Azure, which is properly configured to, let's say, take advantage of multiple things like the whole infrastructure within Azure, the disk, the security, etc. What we have here is basically the possibility of quickly doing a lift and shift of our on-premise databases, because since, again, it is the same SQL Server that we've been using, we just take a backup and we restore it to the new VM, and now we are up and running. The concept of infrastructure as a service is telling us that we need to take care of the infrastructure underneath SQL Server. And with this, I mean that we have to take care of the host, of the operating system, of the networking, the high availability, disaster recovery, etc. Same as we are doing today with our on-premises implementation. So if we are running, let's say, SQL Server 2019 at the top of Windows Server 2019, we need to make sure that we provide the Active Directory for the whole authentication. Eventually, if we need to have an availability group, we have to set up the window cluster and the nodes and set up the whole HA solution. If we need to apply patches or do backups or this kind of thing that we normally do in our infrastructure, we need to do it in this implementation as well. Now, Microsoft is doing some efforts to try to offload some of these tasks, and so they can take care of this without assigning these tasks to us. So let's move to the other bucket that we can find within Azure SQL, and it's platform as a service. In this case, Microsoft is providing us with a SQL Server endpoint, right? In where we don't know, we don't care what is behind the scenes, right? We don't know which operating system, which host, which anything is behind the scenes. We just have a SQL Server endpoint in where we use Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, our application to connect to it and deploy applications, do the administration, do the performance tuning, etc. As a part of platform as a service, we also have the possibility of relying on certain things that Microsoft give us as part of the service. For example, several things that we mentioned before in the infrastructure as a service bucket, meaning the virtual machine, right, are by default part of the service in the platform as a service offering. For example, for high availability disaster recovery, we don't need to worry about setting up the availability group because everything works that way behind the scene. Again, we don't need to do anything. We don't need to set up the cluster, anything. It's part of the service. We don't need to worry about applying patches because Microsoft is doing it again behind the scenes. In terms of backups, also are being made by Microsoft as part of the service, so we don't need to worry about that. And then we can mention that under this platform as a service option, we have two different possibilities. One is Azure SQL Managed Instance, and the other one is Azure SQL Database. Why we have these two options in the platform as a service offering? Well, each of them are targeted to different scope. For example, Azure SQL Managed Instance is mainly targeted as almost 100% compatible with SQL Server. So again, remember what I said about platform as a service, right? But in this case, we have this possibility of taking the backups of our local databases and restore them on a managed instance. On managed instance, we have, again, almost 100% compatibility with SQL Server. That means that we have everything that we've been using forever. SQL Server Agents, database mail, service broker, SQL replication, you name it, right? So it's extremely easy to take our databases, put it in an Azure SQL managed instance, right, and start working on it without worrying about the infrastructure. There are certain small things that are not compatible with SQL Server, but those are minors, right? On the other side, we have Azure SQL Database. In this case, this is more targeted to modern application. And when I say modern application, means that everything lives within a single user database, right? If we go to SQL Server or managed instance, we can have multiple databases as part of our deployment. And if we have, for example, store procedure, we have a join hitting two tables that lives on different user databases, that's not a problem. We have T-SQL, we do our query with the proper joins, and there is absolutely no problem. In Azure SQL Database, everything has to live in one user database. This concept of container, right, or unique database in where all the logins, security, objects, everything lives within that user database. There are different approaches on how to choose each of them, how to do migrations, etc. Right? My suggestion in this case is that, to do an easy lift and shift, first we go to the infrastructure as a service Azure SQL machine offering, right? And immediately after having this in production, we start evaluating managed instance to, have the possibility of having the same power of SQL Server that we've been using, but with all the benefit of platform as a service. And instead, if we are creating a brand new database, a brand new application, well, choose and take a look on Azure SQL Database as the first option. So here are the three offerings that we've been discussing now. Azure SQL, SQL Server running in Azure virtual machines, right? Managed instance, and Azure SQL Database. And then, we can name few topics related to infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Most importantly, right, all these offerings give us business continuity, right, in where with a combination of high availability, automated backup, long-term backup retention, and geo-replication, we can focus on our business, focus on our application, instead of focusing on handling some of the infrastructure things that we've been doing, right? Like backups, patching, etc. On the other side, we have something which is extremely important and really useful in the Azure world, which is possibility of scaling our services easily, right? So with a few clicks, we can have one of these virtual machine and change the machine time, assigning more CPU, memory, faster disk, etc. Then we will see that in the platform as a service offering, we also have the possibility of doing this scaling extremely easily. So is the scale part, I mean, assigning more resources, removing resources, allocating resources depending on a schedule, depending on the workloads, etc., is extremely easy to do. Right? All the benefits related to security within the Azure environments are available within all the Azure SQL offerings. And something that I like a lot is the built-in monitoring and built-in intelligence, which is all the things that we've been using from SQL Server since always, plus the integration with Azure. All the logs capability, the portal capability to check and see performance related metrics, alerts, etc., is something that is really, really nice to see it in action in this environment. The built-in intelligence is basically all the modern performance, let's say, performance features that are targeted to have a stable and powerful transactional environment for our databases. And the last point is versionless. So versionless is something also really important in where we need to consider, right, that if we choose managed instance or Azure SQL Database, it's not like the SQL Server versions 2016, 17, 19. No, it's Azure SQL. There is no version, right? So we don't have to worry that in the future we're going to have a different version, right? It's always, it's versionless, no version, right? Does it mean that it's static, so there's not going to be changes or improvement because it's always the same version? Absolutely not, right? Microsoft is giving us all the new features first in these two offerings, and then moving them to the SQL Server product, right? But we always will see new features in Azure SQL first. So all these things that we have enumerated here allow us to, have the possibility of not dealing with hardware vendors or complex data center contracts, or having to implement high availability disaster recovery, you name it, right? Now, all these things that we enumerate here are part of the service, so we can really focus on our business, on our application, right? In our project, not spending time and resources in the infrastructure part. Mhm. Also, Microsoft give us the possibility to do migrations, different kind of migrations and assessment from our on-premise applications, databases, so we can easily assess a database, right, and prepare the migration to one of these targets. We have Database Migration Assistant and Azure Database Migration Service, which both of them help us to understand what we have, choose the proper destination, and do the final migration. In the topic specific for SQL Server running on Azure virtual machines, well, again, those are the same SQL Server that we've been using. So if we need to take care of the best practices, meaning disk configuration, memory, CPU, is all the same, right? In terms of managed instance, as I said earlier, right, the most important thing is that it's easy to do a migration because we can easily take a backup and restore it to a managed instance, and in a matter of minutes using managed instance. And Azure SQL database targeted to modern application, right? Then we have to choose, depending on our need, which one we use, managed instance or Azure SQL database, depending on the application type that we are dealing with. So if we focus for a minute on managed instance, we can say that there are mainly two tiers: general purpose and business critical, right? General purpose, Microsoft said that it is the right one for most of the existing workload. But if we require, let's say, lower latency for disk, faster recovery, and additional read-only replicas to offload some of the read-only workload, we have the other possibility, which is business critical. Both of them are based on the B core model, in where we choose, the amount of virtual cores and the storage that we're going to be using it. On the other side, for Azure SQL Database, initially it was this model called DTU, right? DTU model, Database Transaction Unit, in where we have to choose the amount of DTUs and assign it to our tier. Now, Microsoft is focusing and also recommending the B core model, same as for managed instance. So we have a couple of tiers here: general purpose, again, business critical, right? Again, we choose the amount of virtual cores, the configuration for the storage, etc. And then an additional tier, which is hyperscale, right? Targeted to much bigger databases. So how do we connect to Azure SQL? A VM, running SQL, managed instance, or Azure SQL database? Well, as we all been doing. First of all, we have the Azure portal to deploy and administer all this offering, right? We will see it in a minute how easy it is to create and administer these resources. How do we connect? Well, as always, Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, which is the new member of the family that allows us to connect to a SQL Server environment and also to other database engines, but specifically to Azure SQL. The beauty is that it's multi-platform, so we can run it natively in Windows, Linux, and Mac. And then, all the components that we've been using forever. T-SQL, right? The T-SQL, the Transact SQL that we learned many years ago and we use, we don't lose it. It's the same, and we use it here with absolutely no problem and no changes, right? So it's extremely easy. PowerShell, SQL CMD, BCP, you name it. We can use any of the things to connect to this Azure SQL offering, same as we can do it to our SQL servers on-prem. So, as a summary, right, I can say that Azure SQL has evolved into the world's best database engine. Azure SQL includes, as I said, virtual machine, managed instance, and Azure SQL database. And the fourth component is Azure SQL Edge, which is SQL Server running on an ARM device. Right? So we can run SQL Server, the same footprint that we know, on an ARM device, like, for example, a Raspberry Pi. Of course, we won't be running our mission critical workload on it, but it's definitely a very good option for certain IoT scenarios. Azure SQL Server running on virtual machine is the best for 100% lift and shift. Same as we have in production in our on-premise environment, we move it to these virtual machines, right? Azure SQL Managed Instance, the power of SQL Server, right? With the benefit of all the platform as a service points that I named before. And Azure SQL Database target to modern cloud application with, again, the benefit of the PaaS offering. So let's see all this in action quickly. Right? So let me jump to my Azure portal, and here under Azure SQL, I have an virtual machine running SQL Server, a managed instance, and an Azure SQL database. Right? We have the three of them deployed here. So let's say that we want to create a new Azure SQL offering. As I showed before, here we have the landing page, right? And we have Azure SQL Database, in where we can create it directly here, managed instance, and virtual machine. See that if I go to virtual machine, right, I have several combination of operating system, SQL Server, version, and edition. You know that since SQL Server 2017, SQL Server runs also in Linux platform on the most important distribution like SUSE, Red Hat, and Ubuntu. So if we scroll down here, right, in the offering, we can find all the combination. And if we go way to the bottom, we can even find SQL Server 2008 R2 running on Windows Server 2008 R2, right? So it's really easy to deploy one of these virtual machine and also these other offerings. I'm connected here with Management Studio to the three of them, right? To manage instance, to my Azure SQL database, and my virtual machine running SQL Server 2019. So extremely easy, same as we've been doing, right? So the connectivity options are exactly the same than the one we know. So to close the presentation, let me go back to the slide. Right, this is also important to mention that Azure SQL is really well integrated with all the other Azure components, right? Service Bus, Databricks, Data Factory, Power BI, you name it, right? is really, really well integrated with all these other members in Azure. All right, very good. So this has been a brief introduction to Azure SQL. I hope you had this sneak peek here, and thank you so much for attending to my presentation. And if you have any question or doubt, please contact me to my LinkedIn or Twitter. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Enjoy the conference. Thank you.